Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are in Alaska or in Hawaii. My name is Krishan Arora. I'm a branch chief in the Network Development Program branch at the Division for Research Capacity Building at NIGMS NIH. I oversee several programs, including the SEPA program, the Science Education Partnership Award Program, for which we are having the pre-application webinar today. I would like to welcome you all SEPA pre-application webinar in response to the Notice of Funding Opportunity PAR-23-137. Next slide, please. At the webinar, they will participate in addition to myself, Michelle Magal, who is Acting Director for DRCB, Tony Beck and Yang Zhao, who are Program Directors and are SEPA Program Co-Leads, Christy Leek, who is Team Leader for Grants Administration Branch, and she has answered for all the budgetary and fiscal questions. All of us will be available to answer the questions after the presentations in a chat that I will be moderating. In the meantime, if any questions come along the way, please type them in the chat so we can answer them afterwards. Next slide, please. Before we start the webinar, there's some housekeeping rules. I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. Both the recording and slides will be posted online on the NIGMS SEPA website. In fact, the slides for this presentation have already been posted on the SEPA website. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box and we will answer them after the presentation. So with that, I'll stop and pass the virtual podium to Tony and Yang. Thank you. Tony?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for participating. We're going to cover somewhat briefly the following bullets in terms of this pre-submission webinar to give you a sense of not only what the program is all about, but how the review process and human subjects issues. So we'll do an overview, the application preparation, review process, human subjects, and the budget. So I'll turn it over to my SEPA co-lead, and we can proceed.
Next slide. Yeah, thanks, Tony. So I will present the program from a high-level overview, and then Tony will delve into the nuts and bolts. And next slide, please. So the overarching goal of the SEPA program is to provide support for STEM-related educational activities in spanning from pre-K to 12th grade, to ensure that students and teachers from all communities and regions of the country have the opportunity to pursue studies in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So here are a few keywords here. SEPA program is for pre-K to grade 12, which is different from other NIH grants that support college or higher education levels. So SEPA program is for pre-college education levels. And it is for students and teachers from all communities and regions of the country. It's not for like a certain area of the country or a certain group of people. And also it needs to be STEM related educational activities. And SEPA also supports informal science education projects for the general public. So general public includes pre-K and grade 12. Informal science education projects are usually conducted in non-classroom settings, such as science centers, museums, and libraries. Next slide, please. So the PI of the SEPA projects must devote a minimum of 2 person month a year and up to 4.8 person month. Multiple PI applications are allowed, but each PI needs to devote a minimum of 2 person month. For the combined MPI effort, it needs to be up to 4.8 person month. If you already have an active SEPA award, you are eligible to submit a new SEPA application as long as the new SEPA project is different from the current one. And there is no more than 6 months overlap between the current active SEPA award and the potential start date of the new SEPA award. Next slide. And the institutional eligibility criteria are actually pretty broad. It includes colleges, universities, institutes, tribal entities, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit organizations. It also includes museums, science centers, and schools, including public, private, charter schools, and also professional societies. I feel like it covers all institutions, but if you feel like your institution is not doesn't belong any of this, please, you can contact us and we can further assess. And if your institution already has an active SEPA award, you are still eligible to submit new applications in a different topic. And importantly, your institution doesn't need to be very strong in research. If you feel like you can provide great science education to pre-K to 12, and we encourage you to apply. And there's one restriction for foreign institutions are not eligible, and foreign components are not allowed. Next slide, please. And SEPA award will support up to 5 years, and each year maximum direct cost is $250K, with plus 8% facilities and admin costs. In SEPA program, a SEPA award is not renewable. If you want to continue your SEPA project, you need to submit a new application to continue the project. Next slide. And SEPA program supports any area of science within the NIH mission. As you know, NIH has many institutes, centers, and offices. We call it ICO. And each NIH ICO has their own scientific interests. And those scientific interests are listed in the funding announcement. I would suggest you take a look. And SEPA program focuses on two main areas. One is classroom-based projects, and the other one is informal science education projects. Quantitative and computational skill development are strongly encouraged. Next slide. And your SEPA project can focus on one or more of these activities listed here. So your project can be a course for skills development, for example, courses in a specific research area, and it can also be hands-on research experience. It can be mentoring activities, and for example, you can develop tools to help students transition into biomedical research field. It can also be curriculum or method development. For example, to develop STEM education resources, new instructional approaches, or computer-based educational tools. And your SEPA project can also be outreach activities, like dissemination of STEM education resources or research findings to the general public or to a certain group of people, like students or teachers in rural areas or tribal communities. Next slide. So this table shows you the due dates for application submission, review, and award. The most important date you should know is that the upcoming application receipt date, June 7, which is about 2 months away. And also I want to mention that resubmission is not allowed. If your application is not funded in this cycle round, you need to submit a new application. Okay, next slide. So now I will pass the baton to Tony.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. And Young, could you, thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about the getting ready process. So the first bullet says, study the entire NOFO carefully, notification of funding announcement. And I say study because sometimes I chat with folks on the phone and they've given the funding announcement a cursory glance and they really don't have a sense of what it's all about. So study it. And the NIH grant application process is very complex. It's got a lot of information that they call required registration. So information about your institution and so on. So get all this stuff done up front. And then go to section 5. It has a review criteria. And it's important to understand that the guidelines for the reviewers are that they only look at 2 documents. One is the funding announcement, in which they have the review criteria and eligibility and everything, but they only look at that. They look at the grant application. They don't go elsewhere. So they have a very narrow focus to make sure that their idea of the review criteria haven't been filtered out by some other extraneous source of information. Next slide. Okay, the NIH, and I'll talk a little bit about it more. The NIH has a sequestered set of players in the review process. So if you go to the back of the NOFO, 3 pages from the end, there's a whole list of program staff from other institutes who can give you advice. But it says, if you have questions, here's 3 people to ask. So they list a program officer, so that's Yang and I. So if you have questions about the science or whether something might be eligible, you send us an email. And the scientific review officer, the SRO, that person deals with the nuts and bolts of the actual review process. So, for example, sometimes people want to include a video. Well, you need to discuss that with the SRO up front and get it all straightened away. You can't just send it in. And then if you have any questions about budget-related issues, Christy Leak is the go-to person. She's been working with SEPA for at least 15 years, maybe longer. And so this is how the kind of information flow occurs prior to submission. And this is where what the NIH does is very different from, say, NSF, where at the NIH there's a true separation between the program officer, or plural in this case, and the SRO who sets up the review. So there's no potential for conflict of interest. At the NSF, not that there's ever a conflict of interest, but the program officer is also the SRO, so they organize the review. And so with the NIH system, like I said, before you submit something, you can talk to anyone and get answers to your questions. Once you push the submit button, then the program officer and the grants management specialist are out of the loop. The only person you can talk to is the SRO. And that's usually related to things like wanting to submit a video or something. It takes 6 or 7 weeks from the time the applications are sent out to the reviewers before they get the reviews back. And during that time, as I mentioned, the program officer and the grants management specialist are out of the loop. The review is conducted, and 2 days after the review, your ERA Commons account will get your scores. The good news, bad news. In about 4 or 5 weeks after that, the summary statements are sent out. Once the scores are sent out, once the scores are posted, the SRO is out of the loop. So if you look at your score and it's a 60, you can't complain to them. That's when it comes back to myself and Yang. So like I said, it's a separation. So again, pre-submission, you can talk to anyone. Once you submit, it's only the SRO. And after the submission, it's only the program officer and the grants management specialist. So it's important to keep these people straight. So there's no potential conflict of interest or kind of crowding of one responsibility into another arena. Next slide. Okay, here's one of the early steps. Get your ERA Commons account. It's not a fast process. You can't wait till the last week and get it done. So get it started earlier because there's a lot of information that you need to upload. And like most of the processes we have at NIH, we have some formal quote unquote apps, but there's also lots and lots and lots of links where you can look at PowerPoints and so on how to do something. And then in most cases, there is a help desk for various parts of this process. So avail yourself of the resources, and if all else fails, then you can call us. It will help. Next slide. The next step here is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the early steps is to study the NOFO. And then you go to the SEPA website. SEPA has a .org website, And you can search by topic, target audience, applicant organizations, so on. It covers the SEPA applications going back to 1991. And you're encouraged to contact the program officer. I mean, the PIs on these applications are quite willing to chat. You can also look at SEPA project by funding year. And for the last 10, 12 years, we've had a wonderful conference report, about 150 pages, covering in real detail and nice pictures of what was going on during those times. Next slide. So the project narrative, this is an important component because one of the things you want to make it easy for the reviewers is to figure out what you want to do. The SEPA research plan is 25 pages. So that makes the average SEPA application about 150 pages. And the reviewers are not reading these on a Monday morning, a fresh pot of coffee. It's at the end of a long week. And so you want to make it easy for them to figure out what you're doing. And so you have a project narrative that really summarizes what the SEPA project's going to do and kind of short, long-term potential. You want them to be able to look at the Gantt chart, figure out who's going to do what parts of the project and when. The logic model is really critical because it's kind of a philosophical look into your plan, your research plan, as to the situation. Here's where we are now, and over on the far right is what we want to accomplish, and in between is what we're going to do. It's important. Excuse me. It's important that you have lots of images and figures and so on in the research plan, and make sure it's very well organized so that if the reviewers are looking at a comment in specific aim 1 saying we're going to have mentors, you can then relate, or they'll say, well, we're going to talk about how we select them and train them in aim 2.3, just to make it easier for them to get around. Next slide. Okay, the research education plan, as I mentioned, it's 25 pages. And what we have here is a long list of some of the major bullets that are summarized and discussed in the NOFO. Notice the Gantt chart and the logic model are critical, and also the next generation science standards. This was something that about 10 federal agencies spent almost 3 years working on back in about 2011, 2012. And the whole point was to normalize or standardize, say, graduation criteria so that 50% graduation rate meant the same thing in all states. And it was also, and perhaps, at least in my mind, more important, it transitioned learning facts and regurgitating them to learning facts, working in teams, and then applying them to the scientific method. And this was just amazing. But it's important with your evaluation and what you're proposing to do, align these with NGSS. Some states don't follow NGSS; they have their own. But regardless, you need to align the outcomes you're going to be quantifying with some standards that are accepted. And in some cases, people come up with some really creative evaluation tools. And if it's something we've never seen before, there has to be some kind of internal standardization to make sure that, when you're collecting data, those data are real. The cultural relevance is important. You need to make sure that the project you're proposing to create and expose your community to is something that they can relate to. And the next bullet is very important, this input from the students and teachers. And not just when you're getting started. It's critical to have a needs assessment going out in the community and figuring out what the students and teachers and parents or families need. But as you're developing the project, say post-award, you need to keep going back and saying, how are things going? Next slide. Okay, so here's some additional things that are required. So a recruitment plan to enhance diversity and instruction for the responsible conduct of research. These have been moved to a new category where they will have an impact on the scoring. The evaluation plan, it's got to be rigorous. If you have a yawn or ho-hum evaluation plan, the reviewers are going to just look at you and shake their heads. Dissemination plan, obviously. Institutional environment commitment. This is something that's required. And then advisory committee. And this is something that's optional. But if you opt to have the advisory committee, you can't name names. but you can talk about the types of people who will give you advice and come in and kick the tires periodically, but also, how often this group is going to be meeting. Next slide. Okay, facilities and other resources and letters of support, they're really linked together because it's important to have institutional commitment. And linked to this is the letters of support. Now, the letters of support go at the end of the application. They don't count as pages, but it's critical that you have letters from 2 groups of people, and maybe 3, at least your academic institution, the dean, whoever's going to give you access to graduate students or postdocs or lab space. And in terms of or let faculty give them time off to work with your students. And it's also critical to have the local schools involved for the same reason. They give you access to the students, the teachers, and periodically you see an application that really well written, but it states we're going to 8 high schools in our city, and there's no letters. So don't ever state that you're going to have some interaction with an entity that's going to support you and not have a letter. And then the other, there was one more point I want to make. I know it is. So both of these groups may include people you've worked with in the past. So often we'll get applications from people who have been successful, say submitting grants to the NSF, and they want to take this in a new direction, a more medical science. So you can't, it's very difficult to go directly from an NSF concept to an NIH because of the kind of division of medicine and so on. But it's important that if you've been doing something before, you can't get SEPA money to keep doing it. And whether it's somebody coming in after 5 years with a new SEPA idea, or somebody who's been doing something for a while, whether or not, regardless of the support, you need to have a clear transition from here's what we've done, here's what we learned, and here's what we're going to do. Here's our hypothesis for the next SEPA. And it's also important that the transition is clearly a new step. It's not just, like I like to say, new paint and carpet. Next slide. Okay, so this is where it's really important to be in touch with the SRO if you want to add some additional materials. Historically, I've always encouraged people not to include an appendix and obviously never use a hyperlink, because there are certain guidelines where you can use an appendix, but the guidelines are not that clear, and it's much better off just not using them than to risk putting something in there that's going to have your application sent back. And the issue here is kind of fairness to everyone else, having extra space or extra time. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that if you want to have a video or you want to include something in your application that is not specifically listed in the guidelines, contact the SRO and explain what you want to do, and get you get an email. Whenever you get a response from one of us feds, it's always important to keep that email, just in case 2 months down the line, there's some question of whether or not you really got permission. But when in doubt, I would say just don't try to add any appendix materials and be very cautious about hyperlinks and URLs. Next slide. Okay, the review process. So I'm going to make a transition here. I alluded to it earlier that sometimes we chat with people who've been very successful writing NIH grants. So you folks are in a pretty good position. But sometimes we talk to people from NSF or Department of Ed, and each agency has its own process that looks the same from afar. There's a funding announcement, there's a program officer to talk to, and you submit an application, it's reviewed, but the process is very different. And so, as I mentioned earlier, with the NSF, the program officer also sets up the review, and the scoring is kind of good, better, best. It put in buckets of excellent, very good, good, and there's also buckets of excellent / very good. So it's a qualitative difference. With the NIH, you get a score. It's a hard, stark score. So if you get a 15 or a 20, you're smiling. If you get a 60, you're not. But you know where you stand. And at least with the NSF, I mean, with NIH and NIGMS, we don't specifically fund based on a pay line, but it's a combination of pay line and a more holistic approach. But the finite priority score you get during review means something. Next slide. So the first step, we alluded to it earlier, where the folks over at CSR, Center for Scientific Review, and the program officer, they look at your grant application to make sure everything's there and there's nothing there that shouldn't be there. And I won't go into details, but you have to make sure that the application organization is eligible, the PIs are eligible, and it's also it's good practice to submit a couple weeks early if you can, because periodically we'll get the sad letter on a Friday afternoon. Somebody waited the last day and they had a glitch at their institution and it won't transfer. But if there's a problem if there's a delay in the application and it's on the part of the NIH, we can work it out. But if it's on the part of the applicant organization, you just have to wait till next year. So like I said, and you have, as of 2010, you have 2 full business days. If you submit something, say you submit your application and NIH finds something wrong. So you have a couple of days of fix-it time. But don't delay. Next slide. Okay, the scientific review. So as I mentioned, with the NIH, the applications come in and the program officer does have some role in the review process, because often I will get an email from the SRO and say, can you send me the name of 6 or 7 people with expertise in this area? So I just, go to my Rolodex and find the folks who have the best expertise in early STEM learning or Science Center Museum, and just send this list without any prioritization. So the applications are then sent out to the reviewers, and they're selected by the reviewers are selected based on the content of the applications. And the reviewers get 4 or 5 weeks to write their summaries, and then they send it back, and they have their preliminary scores for the 5 bullets we'll talk about. One of the things about the SEPA review is, I'm sure I'm biased, but I think it's one of the best examples of peer review, perhaps in the federal government, because at the NIH, we have standing committees of folks, 20 or 30, that serve for several years. And we have the typical special emphasis panel, people who may know each other scientifically, but they meet just once. The SEPA panel, it meets once a year, and about 1/3 of the folks on the panel were on the previous year. Almost all of them have active SEPA projects. So it really is peer review. They understand, they've been in the trenches. They understand the issues of, say, turnovers rates of teachers and kids in inner city. So it really is a great opportunity. But the applications, when they finally come in for review, which is now remote, an application is identified, the lead reviewer and the next 2 reviewers are identified. They each give their preliminary scores, and it's a kind of a gut reaction or gut feeling they have of the overall application based on these 5 bullets: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, research plan, and environment. So, the individual reviewers might give more impact for the approach than, the next one down, who might think the investigator is more important. But nonetheless, they give their initial scores, then they have a discussion, and then they give their final scores. And prior to the actual face-to-face, the SRO will identify the top 50% based on scoring. And this is simply a practical matter. A typical SEPA review takes 2 full days, and we'll never push into the above the 50% success rate, at least not to my knowledge. And so there's no point in having a formal discussion and adding 2 more days to applications that are unlikely to be funded. However, the unscored applications, their summary statement is almost identical to those that were discussed. They get the full written summary. They just don't have a little brief synopsis of the actual discussion. Next slide. So here's a visual of the scoring. And so over on the left, the high scores, the 1, 2, 3s, these are projects that really have high program priority and practically no rough edges. I mean, they're just beautifully written. They're fun to read. In the middle, you've got those that in the 4, 5, 6 range. And these are applications that either are high program priority, but poorly written, or well written, but nothing exciting about the content or what they want to do. And then over on the right are those with low program priority and poor writing skills. So this is generally how the big picture of the scoring. Next slide. These are also factors that kind of come into the scoring process, but they're not discussed in great detail at the review or say on the face-to-face. So protection of human subjects, the vertebrate animals, biohazards where they're present, the recruitment plan to enhance diversity and training responsible conduct of research. In the last funding announcement, these were transitioned to going from no impact on scoring to impact on scoring. And any SEPA project that proposes to put students or teachers into a laboratory has to have a special section on laboratory safety. And then other considerations is the budget. And the budget is something that it's not always clear what you can and cannot do. Although Christy is always great in terms of giving very precise, here's what you can, here's what you can't do. But periodically there's issues where maybe the reviewers don't think that the teachers are getting paid enough, or they think there's too much money going to salaries. But these are discussions from the assigned reviewers that don't enter the score and are discussed after the score is locked in. But it's still an issue. And these are all resolved prior to an actual award. Next slide. Okay, this is important. Periodically, and it's happened twice in my 23 years of SEPA, where either before the review or during the review, or maybe after the review, somehow one of the reviewers got hooked up with one of the applicants or vice versa. So, and it causes a lot of problems. And so it's critical that if you remember our kind of separation of roles is once the application is sent, once you push submit, the only person you talk to is the SRO. And, they'll do their best to keep you happy, but they're not going to remove a reviewer simply because there's some, anyway, this is something very important to keep your eye on, is just let the system manage itself. Next slide. Okay, human subjects. So we're just going to give a very brief overview of this. Like most of the areas we're covering, there's a wealth of information, both videos, webinars, PowerPoints, written documents to explain this process, which is not always 100% clear. But with human subjects, next slide. So here is the formal definition of human subjects, and it involves the research. So research involving living individuals where data are used, interactions for the collection of biospecimens, not so much with the SEPA, sometimes surveys. For example, testing a new educational technique, focus group, survey, interviewing. And there's a link there with a lot of this information here. But, in general, next slide. So in general, I wouldn't say it's a toss-up, but SEPA projects can either be human subjects equals yes, or no human subjects. And the ultimate decision for this is made by the IRB, Independent Review Board, at that applicant organization, because they have the ultimate decision process. And so it's really important that if you can, trot down the hallway across the quadrangle and talk to these people. And because in some cases, the IRBs are very familiar with education. In other cases, they may have never seen this before. their focus or their expertise is clinical trials. And if you're in a small institution or science center museum, you may have to go online to find an IRB. It's a more difficult process. But what you want to do is talk to them and say, okay, here's what I want to do. My target audience is Head Start kids, and we want to teach them math and math-related topics. And here's kind of overview what we do. What do you think? And they'll give you kind of a ballpark answer. And this is useful because the application itself will ask you whether it's human subjects and are you going to claim an exclusion, things like that. So getting some upfront information from the experts is always good. There's lots of resources. So there's a decision tool. I don't want to go into a great deal, but there's a lot of information online. In fact, half the time when somebody sends me an email and says, Tony, I have a question about this, the first thing I do is go online and look it up. So the internet is a great resource. And this last little bullet, I think, is important. Unfortunately, there's a lot of overlapping acronyms in the field. And so a randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard for evaluation, the RCT, is not the same as the other RCT, which is a randomized clinical trial. So this sometimes comes up in your discussions with your IRBs. Next slide. Okay, I'm turning it over to the guru of budgets.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, my name is Christy Leek. I have worked, as Tony mentioned, with SEPA for almost 15 years now, which is kind of wild. So I have seen a lot, but by no means have I seen everything. So, after this webinar, please feel free to reach out if you have any specific questions. Next slide, please. So this is general guidance for SEPAs. The SEPA program is very specialized, so a lot of the questions that you're going to have are pretty specific to the project that you are proposing. The first bullet is, again, it's a guideline. This is not black and white. This is basically to say that, the SEPA project that you are proposing should not be a conduit of funds. Your organization, as the prime grantee, should have the majority of the scientific direction and therefore budget included in your application for your institution to manage. Again, we understand that specific SEPAs have different layouts, designs. So the 20% guide for subcontract costs is a guideline. Feel free to reach out to Tony or myself if you have any specific questions on how you're proposing your project. The next 3 bullets look contradictory. I understand. They are not. This is really to say that there's a longstanding policy for NIH applications that escalation, as in the 3% cost for supplies added every year, 3% budgetary inflation for personnel, is not going to be awarded by your NIH in your NIH grant. The policy states that you can continue to request it if it is in line with your institutional policies, but that NIH does not have to honor those requests. Again, this is information for you to discuss with your institution when you're putting your application together. If you have specific questions, please reach out. But again, this is information. There's a link on the slide if you have any additional questions about this. Next slide, please. So this is sort of in terms of how the NOFO is set up. I'm just going to sort of go over what is allowable in terms of the different cost categories. So the personnel costs are pretty basic, pretty applicable to every application that you're going to submit. Personnel costs are just the people who are involved in designing, directing, and implementing the resource, the research education project. Again, salaries, there is an NIH salary cap that's listed out there. Please make sure that the salaries that you're requesting do not exceed that because they will be cut. And again, the mentoring piece is a little bit specific, but again, if you have questions, please ask. Next slide, please. So the participant costs are those who are involved in the proposed research education activity. because SEPA spans the breadth of NIH research, each project is going to be very specific, but again, it is the people that are participating in the SEPA education project who would fall into this category. They may be paid specifically if their participation is vital to the project, and the cost should be itemized in the proposed budget. Next slide, please. Meals, this is a big one because we know that some SEPA applications require, participant involvement in terms of however they are brought into the proposal. These meals, there is a very specific meal policy listed in our grants policy statement. It very much hinges on the idea of a working meal being integral to the project, i.e. if people are not going to come because it's an after school activity and you need to be able to feed the participants in order to keep them in the activity, that would be allowable. Again, please make sure that you, in your budget justification, that you provide why the meal is integral to the project and to the success of what you are proposing. That's true for all costs, but meals very specifically. Next slide, please. Again, as I was saying, all costs should be, you should provide justification for how all costs are reasonable, allocable, necessary, and consistently treated. Those are the tenets for how we approve all costs in grant applications. The way in which we review this information is based on the justifications that you provide to make sure that the costs that you are requesting are incredibly relevant and necessary for the project. So, a lot of times people say, well, how do I know if it's reasonable, allocable, necessary, and consistently treated? Your Office of Sponsored Programs or equivalent office at your institution is the first place to check. People there are usually fairly well acquainted with federal policies and these types of requests. So definitely reach out to them first. I am another option, but definitely check with your Office of Sponsored Programs or equivalent office first, because a lot of the responses that I will be able to provide often have the caveat of if it's in line with your institutional policies. There's no blanket guidance that I'm going to provide you where you can take it to your Office of Sponsored Programs and say, see, NIH said I could do it. No, NIH says you can do it as long as your institutional policies are in place to make sure that that is appropriately applied. Next slide, please. So program-related expenses, really this is sort of the general bucket of anything that you need in order to complete the aims and goals of your project. Consultant, equipment, travel, all of these costs are allowable, again, as long as they are justifiably necessary for the project. Again, one final bullet is that funds to support travel to the PI conference should be requested in the budget. Again, that's an allowable cost for these awards. And most, as always, costs should not duplicate items that are already available at the applicant institution. But again, it's good to restate. Next slide, please. Allowable and unallowable costs. This is sort of guardrails in terms of how you justify the costs. Teachers and students that are participating in SEPA projects can be compensated for their participation in the project. A lot of times people write stipends for this type of thing. As you see under the next cost category, stipends are not allowable in R25 awards. They're very specific cost categories reserved for NRSA training mechanism, training grants, fellowships, and the like. However, it's a matter of clarifying how the costs will be used. And again, the guidance that I always provide is compensation for participation is always safe. You know, that's the one you want to really keep in the back of your mind. Again, incentive payments to volunteers or participants are allowed. Please make sure you justify and clarify how they will be used. Now, the unallowable costs, we discussed stipends. Entertainment is not allowed. You know, entertainment is not directly related to the aims and goals of a project. We understand, you know, sometimes participation, you want to get people involved, you want to get people excited. Just having like an end of year banquet or, you know, a graduation ceremony for the people involved, that's not going to be allowed. Please do not request things like that. Gifts are not allowed on NIH awards, nor are promotional items. So again, it's really getting in the mindset of what is necessary and allocable for the project that you are proposing. But please be aware that these costs will be removed from your budget. I believe that's my last slide, but next slide we'll just check. Oh, no, sorry. These are questionable costs. Some of these things, so specifically like honoraria and stipends, there are very specific descriptions in the NIH grants policy statement for how these costs would be allowable. Honorarium, we understand, are almost always speaker fees. You gotta, you know, compensate speakers for coming, for speaking. That's allowable. That's 100% allowable. Call them speaker fees. Please don't call them honoraria, because we will have to clarify, and it just takes longer for us to clarify any questionable costs that are submitted. General supplies, obviously, most projects require supplies to get it done. However, please make clear in your budget justifications that those supplies that can be considered general supplies, pens, paper, printers, all the like, that those costs are specifically related to your SEPA project, and that you have a institutional policy in place that allocates them directly to this project. If that's not in there, that's what NIGMS will request, or your other ICO. So just if you have that in there up front, that's really helpful. Again, I like to hit it. Clear again that all costs should be allowable, reasonable, allocable, and necessary for your project. Next slide. Oop, that's it. Okay, that's it for me. I think we're holding questions till the end, but I will be here all week. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Okay. So we are going to have now Q&A session now. Let me look at the chat and read the questions, you know, to, if you, my colleagues can come up, you know, and unmute themselves as a question, you know, come up. The first question is about the F&A rate. The question is, does the 8% F&A rate mean that the organization cannot charge their federally negotiated indirect cost rate?
That is correct.
F&A rate?
Yeah, for SEPA R25 awards, 8% is the max allowed for F&A. So correct. Even though your institution has a federally negotiated rate, 8% will be awarded on top of SEPA awards.
Thank you. And the next question also relates to the F&A part actually. Is the F&A rate based on the total budget? So for example, 20,000 per year for direct cost or 250K, which is for the SEPA allowed money.
Yes, yes. You're not allowed 8% on it's a MTDC 8%. But yes, it would be allowed on all of the costs.
Thank you. Next question is, Tony, maybe you want to take it. It's about the eligibility. We state that in a museum, science center, etc., you know, they are eligible to apply for a SEPA grant. Is the eligibility truly includes non-profit organizations? Some are community-based educational centers, which is not a museum, science center, etc. Please clarify.
Yeah, yes, if you go to the SEPA funding announcement, there's a long list of eligible organizations. And so, you know, historically, the only time I take pause is when I get a call from a for-profit organization and they want to use the SEPA as kind of a high-end SBIR. But I think the basic ground rule is that if you're proposing a SEPA project that's going to use taxpayer dollars to create STEM resources, the resources need to be put back into the project, the participants, the schools at no cost. If what you want to do is going to create a widget that you then sell, then it's an SBIR.
Thank you. So the next question is about the scores on the application. The question is, are scores posted about 2 months after submission? When are score posted, on the for the SEPA applications?
No, well, each applicant needs to set up their ERA Commons account, and that's basically your conduit between all things related to your grant. And so I think it's usually about 2 days after the review, the scores are posted on your ERA Commons site. And then 5-6 weeks later, the summary statement, which is typically about a 14-page document, is also made available. But the overall scores, identity of the applicants, the number of applications, all those data are not made public.
Yeah, that also means that, if the application is being submitted, say in June 7th, normally they will be reviewed sometime in late fall, October, November. And so the scores on those applications after the review, peer review, will be posted after a few days, of the review meeting. So sometime in November or early December.
And just a note of caution, we mentioned that the scores are posted 2 days after the review, but the summary statements come out about a month later, maybe longer. And we ask you patience because often there's issues related to the actual dialogue between the assigned reviewers that the program officer may remember from the physical review, but the reviewers have a certain period of time after the review, the formal face-to-face review, if you want to call it that, to amend their application comments. And so there's really no point in trying to discuss your priority score with the critiques listed in the summary statement until the summary statement's out. Just a request from staff.
Thank you, Tony. So the next question is on the maximum number of awards that are available this year. Is there a maximum number of awards available this year?
Well, I guess the answer is yes. The thing is, the budget moves up and down every year. This year, we still don't have a final budget. And one of the other factors that enters into this is that last year, the NIH activated a trans NIH SEPA program where other institutes and centers, such as Nursing Research Institute, are allowed to basically adopt a SEPA. So after the review and the summary statements are posted, the other, NIGMS circulates this list, and other institutes have the option of taking over the management of a SEPA. It retains the SEPA branding name, but the new institute will provide the 5 years of funding, the programmatic oversight, the grants management oversight, and each time that happens, it frees up a unit of money for a new SEPA award. Those dollars go back to NIGMS. So we really don't know until towards the end of the fiscal year. I'm not giving you a straight answer, but over the last 5 or 6 years, the number of awards has been going up slowly, but we just never know with the variability of budgets and the ability of Congress to pass a budget.
And also, just to further add to this one, that since the SEPA is a trans NIH program, and number of other ICs, nearly 20 or so, they participate in the SEPA program. So we are able to make more number of awards. Total number of awards are gone up in last 2 years.
Yeah, very good point.
In terms of number of proposals, does SEPA fund multiple proposals from the same organization during a given cycle?
Yes, the funding announcement states that, and this was a change we made several years ago, that an organization may have more than one SEPA application at the same time. We have yet to see an organization submit multiple applications for a single cycle. But the SEPA funding announcement, the SEPA program covers any area of NIH funded research. It covers every target audience from the general community to Head Start kids. It uses any methodology. The subject matter varies. And so the funding announcement is specifically, I wouldn't say vague, it's just there are areas where I think one would argue that the text in the funding announcement can be discussed. Michelle, did you want to comment on that at all?
Sure. You are able, an organization can put in multiple SEPA applications. It is not considered during the review process. So it will not be part of the reviewers' comments or their consideration about whether or not there's more than one application. So that's not an issue. And then we look at, obviously, what's the great ideas out there? And we try to make funding decisions based on that. So we encourage, people, if their organizations want to put in different applications on different topics from different PIs, that would be great.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, in fact, we encourage, and we are there's no cap, that they can submit more than one application, Do the applicants, can they request budget for an external evaluator?
Yes, the evaluation is something that's been evolving quite a bit over the last 20 years. I've been managing SEPA, but in general, the evaluator has to be independent. And so there's different ways of defining this. Many institutions have schools of education that have professional evaluators that provide professional and unbiased evaluation services for the community. There is also a large cohort of independent evaluators out on the free market. And
Tony,
so,
the question is, are they allowed to request budget for an external evaluator?
yeah, okay, I'm heading there.
Yes, it's up to a maximum of 10% of the direct costs may be devoted to evaluation related activities.
Yeah.
That is clearly stated in the NOFO.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Christy.
So the answer is yes. I apologize for verbally wandering.
The next question is, with respect to DEI, if we work, I'm reading the question, if we work for an institution who is not allowed to have DEI departments or personnel, will that be taken into consideration when evaluating the diversity plan?
So let me take this one just as a little bit
Please.
of background on the diversity, equity, inclusion
Sure.
policies.
Thank you, Michelle.
So we are aware that this is a hot button topic for the entire nation, probably at this point. But the goal of the SEPA program is to ensure that all communities have access to good science education, right? And so making sure that the inclusiveness spreads across whoever your community is important, right? So that everyone has access to that. That's inclusiveness, not a diversity effort, right? Or equity issue. Well, it is equity in the sense that, everyone needs that, but it's usually not an issue. I think you can look at those plans and design them accordingly and think about them in ways that your organization is allowed to manage. This is not about a department, right? This is about going out to the community and engaging them in ways that are meaningful, right? So it's very simple. Who's your community? Who do you want to work with? Is access an issue for them, and are you giving them access so that it is inclusive? And I think that's a better way to pursue this rather than thinking about diversity and underrepresented groups.
Right. Thank you, Michelle. In terms of putting together the application, Tony, maybe you can address this question. Developing the aspects of the program, especially the need assessment. Is it a part of the grant, or can they, the program be fully developed, before they submit the application?
Think of this as an SBIR. You're a small company, you're working in your garage, you want to make a widget, and there's no point in making a widget nobody wants. And so it's important to go out to the community and find out what their needs are. In fact, in 1991, when NIH created the SEPA program, one of the unique features was the fact that it was the first time that NIH mandated that the researchers who wanted to create this STEM content had to work with the teachers and parents to figure out what the community wanted. And so if the topic is something of value to the community, and you find this out up front, they're going to work much harder to make sure that it happens. And it's also critical as you're developing the project. Remember, SEPAs are 5 years. It's research education. So there's a lot of starts and stops where a great idea turns out to be not so great when you hit it with some reasonable evaluation. And so, this constant feedback and interplay between the SEPA project and the stakeholders is critical.
Yeah.
So, and this is part of, like I said, it's part of the development plan. And certainly you can bring in a few focus groups and get a sense from your community, this is what we're interested in. And then, if the award is made, then you definitely focus in a little bit more and find out, is this really what you guys want? What's the timeline? And often we will make an award to a SEPA that still hasn't got all those answers. And so it has a delay in the actual beginning of the project until they really figure out what the community wants.
Thank you. So that means they need to come up with a need assessment before they put together the application, they submit the application, right? So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense to picture the reviewers.
yeah.
These people want to do something and there's no justification at all as why they want to do it other than they think it's a good idea.
Next question about the resubmission. I think, what does it mean that it cannot be resubmitted? Can the review comments be incorporated for a new submission?
Michelle, you want to handle this one?
Sure. But what we mean by not being able to resubmit is that in the NIH speak, the first application was considered application 0, ground zero, right? And then the next submission, if you responded to reviewer critiques, there are specific sections of the application where you would have a chance to do that. And then you would call that the A1, a resubmitted application. You can't do that here. You have to submit as a brand new application every time. Of course, we'd encourage you to pay attention to the reviewer critiques and address them in the new submission. But you shouldn't refer to the prior application. You should go about this as if it were a brand new application. You don't get the section that is called response to reviewer critiques. You don't get to include that. All you do is use the prior comments to help you craft a better proposal, and then you treat it as if it's brand new.
And reviewers have short memories, and at least for SEPA, only about a third of the reviewers at the previous year. So I've yet in the last couple of years heard a comment, well, we saw this last year. And so it has the benefit of not having the, let's say, the less positive comments from the reviewers of the previous application that in the old system, that's probably the first thing the new reviewers looked at. So it gives your application the benefit of bringing in these expensive consultants, i.e. the previous review panel, and giving you a lot of very, very valuable advice.
The next question is on the, if you can expand the distinction between the advisory committee, which cannot be identified in the application, versus partners and collaborators, where support letters are strongly encouraged.
Okay. Again, it's kind of a fuzzy area. In general, and my colleagues can comment, in general, the letters of support from the academic folks are, those are the ones that, like I said, let you into the laboratories and gave you equipment. In terms of the scholastics, say the schools, this could be people that worked with you in the past and they've had successes. It's been good for the schools. And this is good because often we'll see a letter of support from, say, a district superintendent saying, we worked with you the last couple of years, and even though your project was brand new, it's been very successful, or students are happy. That's a case history. It's a place for you to shamelessly market your previous successes. And this other committee, which is an advisory committee, is more of the hard love. You know, they're the ones that come in periodically and you give them a report and they look at the, progress of the project or the outcomes of evaluations and say this works, this doesn't. And this is a new policy over the last few years, not to name names, but I think it makes sense. So it really is a difference in kind of the concept of what these people do versus the letters of support or people you've worked with in the past and can say, yes, these are good guys. We had much success with their program.
And also, I think the advisory committee member, they can advisory in nature, they can advise about the program, whereas partner and collaborators kind of are, integral part of the program, they can, essential, they're to implement the program activities, so there's a difference, I think, that way,
Yeah, the advisory committee should be independent and should
Yeah.
not be involved
Alright.
directly in the project.
Right.
The other advantage to you all for not naming names of advisory committee members is because once someone's name's in an application, they cannot be a reviewer. You may be eliminating your biggest fans, people who know more about your research field, if you suggest that those people in advance. So that's why we ask you not to name names.
The question about the, if you have an established SEPA website, how do you avoid using a hyperlink? Do you refer to the website without providing the web address? If you have prior SEPA website.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a Luddite. I wouldn't know the answer to it, but I'm sure there are folks out there who do.
If you have already established program SEPA and you have website and you are proposing a different application or different program, and you are going to highlight your strength, for the program that you are able to manage that, do the SEPA program, I think it's okay to include that hyperlink, that you have, already track record of.
No, it's not, really not okay.
No?
And think about it from this perspective, right? Reviewers are only asked to review what's in the application. Hyperlinks go elsewhere, and they can, you from a fact that if you run your own website, you can track who is actually looking at it. And so to protect reviewer anonymity, that's one of the reasons they're asked not to click on any links.
Okay.
In your bio sketch, if you have a paper, if you have an outcome of something that is listed, that is linkable. So think about that, and just, you have to be creative and describe what you've done in the past. If you use it in the body of the application, it's a potential reason why the folks who do the initial screening of applications for compliance may kick it out, and nobody wants to be kicked out on a technicality. So,
Okay.
Don't take the risk is my advice.
Yeah, so you can describe your track record, in the bio sketch, Can you have a main PI and 2 co-PIs?
Yes.
Young, why don't you take this and explain the total months and whether or not 3 PIs are allowable or feasible, right? Because here there's just a contact PI, but in the NIH world, co-PIs are equivalent. So Young, why don't you explain the math behind the allowable effort?
So the question, first I want to make sure you want to say the main PI is the contact PI, and co-PI, what is the co-PI? So for NIH definition, we use multiple PI, MPI. So if you mean those 2 co-PIs is MPI, that's another thing. If just a co-investigator, like a collaborator kind of co-PI, that is okay. And as Michelle mentioned, there's a requirement for the minimum effort. So for the PIs, including MPI, the minimum calendar months is 2 calendar months. So if you have 1, that is 2, right? And if you have 2 multiple PIs, that will be 4. If you have 1 contact PI and 2 MPI, that will be 6. And what is the limit for the total maximum allowed calendar months? That is 4.8. So 6 is about 4.8. Yeah, so depend on the purpose of your project and how many PIs, that's something you need to consider. You can consider as co-investigator rather than MPI.
Right. Is this award only for new programs, or can an award be used for an existing program?
Okay, the SEPA funding is not to keep an older program going where your NSF funding ran out. The SEPA funding is to take, your prior program and build on it. So similar to SEPA projects that have completed 5 years, and they're making a transition, say in neuroscience, from a program that focused on high school kids, and they realize that they'd like to go down to middle school kids. So it's a change in the focus of the project, but it's a significant change. It's not just a subtle change, but SEPA is not to take an existing infrastructure and just providing more money. So for example, you've been receiving funding from a number of agencies to send students off to universities during the summer, a block of 5 or 6 students per university to work in the labs. SEPA is not new money to send a different cohort of students to different labs.
What are the requirements for eligibility for the PIs? What eligibility requirement they must meet,
Oh, it's simple. I think the funding announcement, if I can paraphrase, it says anybody with the skills and talents and ability to carry out the proposed project. And I often will get calls. I talked to somebody on the phone. It's a young junior faculty member, and very, very talented, ready to go. And then about 4 phone calls in, they say, well, my departmental chairman said that I'm too junior to be a SEPA PI, and we have a professor emeritus who's only 87 years old, and they want him to be the PI. And the answer is no. The PI needs to be the person who's going to make this happen. And typically the projects now, because projects are more complex, has a multi-PI plan. And a bit of clarification within the multi-PI plan, there are key individuals, key personnel identified by the applicant, and I like to call these lowercase k and p. And then there's key personnel identified by NIH, particularly when something's moving forward for an award. So, and Young alluded to it earlier that, within the personnel, you could have an MPI team, 2 or 3 people, but you also have some co-investigators who are very senior people that have critical parts of the project, but they're in a smaller effort.
The next question, maybe Tony, Young, you can take either of you. If you are bringing students into a lab space, or giving experience, for hands-on learning, do you need an equipment document along with the facilities and other resources document, or are you able to add the lab description within the facilities and other resource document? Do you need a separate equipment document in addition to the facilities and resource document, or one can do,
Well, I'll try the first thought, is that, you need to explain what the project is going to be. And in some cases, you're doing an after-school club with elementary school kids. And in some cases, you're putting teachers or students into a laboratory, sometimes during the whole summer. And once you're putting the students and teachers into a laboratory, and this is of very high importance to NIGMS, is to make sure that not only are the students and teachers who are benefiting from the SEPA, but also the instructors are really up to date in terms of safety. There's been some horrific lab accidents. And so if you're putting students into a laboratory, you need to describe the laboratory environment. And that, in my mind, I would think that that's the same as the description of the facility, the resources.
Yeah, so they don't need to include a separate document for the equipment, is what you're saying, right?
Oh, the equipment, I would, most of the applications I look at have, 5 or 6 sections, and they list the equipment and the facilities and the data science or the computers. They want to make the place look like it's ready to go.
Yeah, it depends on the proposal, what they are proposing,
Yeah, no point in putting in facilities that have nothing to do with the SEPA.
Yeah. Okay, the next question, maybe Young, you want to take this one? This person is saying that I plan to propose a project that focuses on curriculum development, mentoring, and outreach. would a lack of research experience in the proposal reduce my chances of obtaining funding?
So based on the funding announcement, so there are a few areas you can focus on, one or more of the areas. And based on what you described, you will focus on curriculum development, mentoring, and outreach. That's 3 of them. So definitely it's okay. So you don't have to focus on research,
Yeah.
hands-on or
Yeah,
So
they don't need to focus on all the 5, elements, they can focus 1, 2, or 3, depending upon the focus on the project,
Yes, and I'd like to make a comment. So often, or not often, but periodically during the review, remember when an application comes up for review, the 3 assigned reviewers are identified, the grants identified, and the reviewers give their scores. And then the lead reviewer gives a short overview, because not everyone has to read all the applications, but trust me, if they're interested in early STEM and it's an early STEM application that they weren't assigned, they're going to read it anyway. And if the lead reviewer starts off and says, wow, this is a dynamite concept, it's a great team, the research plan makes sense, but it's overly ambitious. So that is a death knell. So what you want to do is focus. You don't want to try to do too much. You want to do a few things really well. And as Yang and Krishan made the point is, SEPA can focus on a lot of areas, but you don't want to try to do it all.
Thank you. The next question is about the peer review process. How are reviewers identified and what are their professional backgrounds? Are they typically researchers or P212, informal educators, or both?
So the Center for Scientific Review manages the selection of reviewers, and they look carefully to find people who have the expertise needed for the types of grants that they get. And so you could expect a mixture and a good variety among the reviewers that are there. And as Tony already mentioned, there's a good, healthy number of them are likely to have been SEPA PIs. So they will have the breadth of experience to review the applications in front of them.
The next question is about evaluation. For the evaluation, are control groups required or is it pre and post adequate?
Good question. The thing is, in the education field, there's no such thing as a perfect control group. You just do the best you can. And so if you're doing an after-school science club where students and teachers are coming and going, or a mobile lab, you have very little control over who's going to be there. Same thing with a museum exhibit. So you just do the best you can. And one of the issues to think about is periodically a review, an application will say, we're going to target 3 middle school classes in this school. And the other 3 classes will be controls. And every once in a while, the reviewers say, well, that's really not fair. You have to come up with a plan so that the control group, the have-nots in year 1, gets some exposure to the intervention in year 2. So there's ways of getting around it. But the control group is, you just do the best you can. And the other part of it that we alluded to earlier is that, when you get to inner cities or rural areas, I think some inner cities have a 50% turnover of teachers every year. So teachers and kids, the transitory nature of some of these target populations is the best. But you do what you can, because remember, the reviewers, most of whom are SEPA PIs, have been in the trenches, so they know the issues.
Thank you. I think this same person, also submitted another question. If we want to apply under NIMHD, do we also consult anyone at that institute in addition to the PO?
The interesting question, because the trans-NIH activity is designed not to create new focus areas to be addressed during the review, but rather to allow the post-SEPA review. And remember, we've mentioned several times, the only thing the reviewers are supposed to look at is the SEPA funding announcement and the applications. So an applicant, and we've seen this, who spent a lot of time talking to a program officer at another institute, and in a cover letter said, I spoke to this program officer. That doesn't come into play into the review or the priority score. However, it does come into play once the summary statements are out and scores are out, and we ship this document around and we give the program staff, the participating ICs, you have 3 weeks to make a list of the applications you're interested in, and then send it back, and then we'll try to fix up the dating service. So the dialogue that an applicant will have can help them fine tune their project. And this is brand news, but I would guess that an applicant who spoke with a program officer, and that's the whole, one of the benefits of this, instead of having myself and Young, where I know a little bit about a bunch of stuff, now you're having the applicants talk to program staff whose area of expertise is infectious diseases. So it just improves the scientific dialogue.
The next question is there a role for theoretical calculations and computer manipulations with this grant? And if so, what sort of projects in the area were supported?
Well, the answer is yes. You can go to the SEPA website. You can, look at the application we funded over the last few years. The program is quite varied, but the whole point is there's lots of tools to get kids interested in science, to give them training in the scientific process, working in teams, problem solving. And so often let's call it the hook, the thing that gets the kids working in these teams and learning without realizing they're actually, doing the hard work in terms of data management and something.
And also to add to this, what you're saying, Tony, that we have funded many SEPA projects in the area of bioinformatics and also data science also, so
yeah.
So we do, I think, support, the projects in that area.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is on, do private companies have to collaborate with the university or science museum or for a SEPA project?
What kind of a company?
Do private companies?
Primary.
Private.
Oh, private. Sorry. No. I mentioned it earlier that, pretty much anyone is eligible to submit a SEPA application, but your purpose has to be very clear. It's to support the role of SEPA, or the goals of SEPA, which is to, number one, improve the workforce diversity and give these kids in isolated areas an opportunity to think about science. There's a concept called Lost Einsteins that means there's all these kids around the country that have the talent, but they've never had the opportunity. So I think it's really important to think about that. And the second goal is increasing public health literacy. This is why Congress in 1999, or maybe it was, 1999.
And the answer is simple. Nonprofits and for-profit organizations are completely eligible. So you don't have to form partnerships. You just have to have a good project.
Next, I think 2 or 3 questions there regarding IRB. Michelle, you want to take those?
Is IRB required for the proposal? IRB approval is not until the time of award. So no, you do not have to have IRB approval to submit, whether that's IRB determination of an exemption status or not. Let me just say that SEPA projects are not, it's an R grant, but the R stands for resource here, and they are educational projects. So they really should not be doing the research. They are not a substitute for you putting in a research project grant to do research on certain populations. So what you want to do is have participants. You're welcome to give them surveys to help you improve and get some feedback about the project. And you can use rigorous analytic techniques from what you observe to help you design a better program in that continuous feedback loop that Tony mentioned. So all of that is allowable, but most of the time, if you're not doing research per se, you're giving surveys to participants, it can meet the definition of human subjects research by the NIH definition, but it's going to be exemption 1 or exemption 2. If you have a consultation with your IRB and they tell you that the project looks like it's non-exempt human subject research, my advice to you would be to reimagine your program and restructure it so that it does not involve human subjects research that is non-exempt. If you're doing more than surveys, exemptions 1 or exemption 2, then probably you're overreaching with what you should do. And your IRB is just going to evaluate what you put in the proposal. So take a step back and restructure. Is research required, or can it be an evaluation that will not necessarily require an IRB? Research is not a requirement of this. In fact, I just explained it shouldn't necessarily be research on the participants. It is an educational grant. So keep that in mind as you're designing this. Your IRB can give you a quick check on that. And again, how you structure your grant is just important.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for explaining the IRB requirements, which are for SEPA grants. The next question is wondering if chemical demonstration shows either at the home institution or at schools would be a good way to encourage students into NIH STEM fields. Chemical demonstration, they're saying, I think showing, basically, hands-on activities they're referring to. Tony, you want to say something about that?
Sorry, I lost my screen for a few minutes. That kind of exploitive demonstrations, it really doesn't have a place with SEPA. It's like going to say a fairground dirt track racetrack and watching the car smash up. It would bring in the audience, but probably for all the wrong reasons. So my first reaction would be to tell this individual, if it was an applicant, and just say, look, go to the SEPA website, look around, read the funding amount, see what kinds of projects we're funding and how they fit into the, to answer the needs of the SEPA program, which when you go all the way back to 1991 was just provide more opportunities for kids from underserved communities to think about careers in health and medicine, and so having the excitement of combustibles to bring in an audience doesn't necessarily mean you brought them in for the right reason.
I think the same person also had a same question, I think mentioned again in the chat, would a chemical demonstration show constitute entertainment? Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's teaching them the concept, of science, what they're trying to show.
I would just say, encourage them to send me an email and we can talk about it. Because, one of the things is it's always easy to take an interesting concept that's really not aligned with SEPA and tweak it a little bit and get creative and come up with a concept that does align with SEPA.
Christy, you want to maybe take this next one? Is it required for all PIs to request salary, benefit, compensation for the application to be taken seriously? Do you want to say anything?
So I can tell you that it's not required. I can't comment on whether or not your application will be taken seriously. I think what we look at is, are you devoting the necessary time and effort to appropriately manage this award and get to the aims and goals? You are not required to request your salary, but you are required to devote the minimum amount of effort listed in the NOFO.
This is something we don't see often, but when we do, it's typically praised by the reviewers. When you see somebody, particularly fairly senior, who's got a busy schedule, who's willing to put 10% effort with no compensation into a SEPA project because he or she thinks it's a worthwhile effort. That's not a stamp of approval, but I don't think I've ever heard a reviewer say, what a silly idea.
Maybe Christy, maybe you want to also take this one, next one. If a PhD student will work on the project, is their stipend not allowed in the budget? I think
Compensation is
Yes.
allowed. As long as you don't use the term stipend, because stipend is solely allowable on an NRSA grant, fellowship training grant.
Yeah.
If you put stipend in, because that is your institutional policy, NIH will reach out to clarify what exactly you mean by stipend. But again, personnel, their salary, their effort can be paid from the grant.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I'm just going to ask everyone to keep our answers brief because we're already over time and there are lots more questions to be answered.
Yeah.
So
thank
let's
you.
just keep it all very brief and to the
Yeah, the
point.
next question maybe I can address that one, is do the applicant need to identify which institute they would like submit their project to, NIGMS versus another institute, or is that sorting done after the submission by NIH? So this happened after the review process. So they all come to NIGMS and then the peer reviewed, and then we share the scores and the summary statement, with the other institute centers, and then they decide, which is of their interest and mission area, and then they decide. So you don't need to identify in the application, I think this you already I think addressed that, Christy. Are participant stipends allowed for students? So we do not allow stipends for this grant, right?
Again, compensation for participation.
Compensation, yeah. It has to be
That's
listed
what
as
you wanna-
compensation. Yeah.
That's what you want to go for, compensation.
Yeah. May publication cost be allowed, Christy?
Yes.
Yes. The next question is, if you are running a residential program for teens as part of your program, for example, can you include funds for non-STEM activities as part of your budget, e.g. art, crafts, supplies for evening class activities?
No, that wouldn't be applicable to the aims and goals of your SEPA project.
Can research mentors receive speaker fees?
Yes.
Can awards for participant as part of a competitive process, not a gift, but an award, be purchased?
I would stay away from the term award. Again, incentives for participation are allowed. I wouldn't call it an award.
Award.
Are you using that amount to get them to participate? Call it an incentive. Anything else? No, not allowable.
Thank you. I think that it has been already addressed. The next question, the SEPA project need to have a research component, or can it be outreach focused mostly with evaluation? So it doesn't need to have a research component. It can have 5 different elements that were described, So you can focus on 1, 2, or more than, one, depending upon the nature of the project that you are proposing. Can an academic institution partner with a museum?
Yes, we have many examples. In fact, Science Center museums provide the infrastructure and the medical institution, the expertise. And as was quoted by one CEO, when the doctors in the white coats are here, everything we do is perfect.
What is meant by an area of science within the NIH mission? Is it allowed to do a project in any area of STEM?
Any kind of basic or clinical research the NIH funds.
So you can look at the NIH website and you can navigate through the 24 institutes and centers and look at the types of science that they do, right? So it just has to be related to health, to even NIGMS, our own division, does very fundamental basic research in cells and biology. They cover health-related, water, citizen science projects that relate to projects that are of interest to NIH in general would be fine. They don't have to be, they just have to be sort of medically related, biomedically related, which means anything basic science that could turn into, is important for biomedical research. So just think of it that way. It's very broad.
Yeah. Can research experience for students be limited just to summertime when students are out of school, mixed with other components rest of the academic year?
No, it can be any time of
Yes.
the year. One of the things that's critical is that, if you're doing teacher professional development or working with students, and you're trying to teach them something like CRISPR, you can't do it in one weekend. So the proposed project and the delivery of the learning process has to be realistic in terms of the outcomes you anticipate. So, bottom line is, it's more difficult for students to learn some techniques if they're just doing it 4 or 5 hours a day, one weekend a month, versus full-time immersion hands-on. But this is where the applicant makes the argument as to why this is a good idea. And it's always important when you're trying to market this idea, is to use peer-reviewed literature to justify your statement. And so you can say that, some people worry that, dealing with teachers for just say 1 weekend a month, they're not going to learn anything, but that's actually not true. They learn a lot. So just, back things up with the literature.
Yeah. So Tony, maybe you want to address also this question about the science education in the Science Center Museum. Are professional development projects that support informal science educators' capacity to deliver educational offerings on a particular health topic allowable for SEPA funding?
Absolutely. We probably
Yeah.
have a dozen examples, maybe 2 dozen.
Or does there have to be a deliverable that more directly engages the general public, teachers, students? It can be both, right? So,
Right.
Yeah.
The thing about informal science education is very difficult to quantitatively evaluate either the short-term or long-term outcomes.
Okay, I think this we have been already addressed. Young, you did that. I think will the co-PI be required to budget 2 months per year?
Yeah, if it is multiple PI, it is required to have at least two person months a year.
Yeah. Co-PI depends, what their effort will be there, so what they're going to do on the project. If you have an active NIGMS grant like R15, are you still eligible to apply for SEPA?
I'll take this one because I think the question is related to the stipulation that R15 PIs can only be supported by one research project grant from NIH at a time. However, SEPA is not a research grant. It is
Right.
a resource education grant. So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
You may have your R15 and
Yeah.
your R25.
Yes, that's right. So we highly encourage you to think about that and submit a SEPA application.
Yeah. I think the real issue is to make sure you're not overcommitting where you have another award that requires 51% of your budget, your time. And you're already overcommitted.
Yeah. Do STEM content topics need to be public health exclusively, or can the educational resources cover other STEM areas?
I would just say yes, they can.
They can be in the area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but they relate with the public health, of course,
Yeah, the applicant just needs to make their case clearly and succinctly to the panel that this is in line with the SEPA program goals.
Can foreign country institutions, university students and researchers be part of a SEPA grant with a US institution applying to the SEPA grant?
Toss that to Christy.
Christy?
You're gonna have to email me the question because there's a very specific policy source that I can't remember at this very moment.
I would just say in general that if if their involvement if a foreign country's institution, university students and researchers are involved so actively in the project, it would likely constitute it as a foreign component, and that is not allowed. So I would suggest that you stay away from that and focus on US.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, I would concur.
Is an attitudinal survey a reasonable alternative to a RCT?
I'm sorry, what was the survey?
Attitudinal, they say, based on attitudes, they're.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the self-efficacy and a lot of related individual outcome are really critical to this. And it depends, the evaluation and the data you collect depend on the audience. And the treatment and how often you see the audience. So you just have to come up with some instruments that will give you not only short-term feedback as to whether what you think you're doing right is actually going right, but also long-term.
Yeah. Okay. Can the required website as part of the SEPA award be a page within the organization's website, or does it have to be a complete, separate, standalone website
No, it can be a page.
page?
This has to be identifiable as SEPA and give NIGMS and NI some credit.
Yeah, I understand it as a hyperlink is not the same as providing the website address. It means that you need to type the web address, but as a reference, not as additional material to be reviewed.
No, that's absolutely not true. So you just know here what they're saying is
Yeah.
don't give them, don't make reviewers or
Give
go to another site, right?
Yeah.
I also want to encourage you to download the wonderful slides that Tony and Yang put together, because they have a link to the NIH policy on hyperlinks. And that's what you should look at to think about what you can and can't do.
And disclaimer, Michelle and Krishan put a lot of effort into it too. It was a team effort.
Does SEPA prefer to applied or fundamental research?
Any kind of research, applied fundamental, that's fine. I mean, what you want to do is give the kids some basic tools, explain problem solving, challenge them with a good idea, and then stand back and let them do it.
Okay. Will having an R35 from NGMS affect the ability to obtain a SEPA R25? Michelle, you want to address them?
Yeah, because it's not a research grant, it's not an issue, but the MIRA R35 from NIGMS has specific requirements for effort of your research available time. And if you become overcommitted because you're doing other things and the amount of total time available for research shrinks, your MIRA PI program officer may object. So I would suggest you have a conversation with them about the suitability of your being the PI on a MIRA grant. It's not allowed, but you have to manage your time. R15s don't have the same time constraint on them that MIRAs do.
Tony, you want to maybe address this one? Can you provide more guidelines around the Gantt chart? For example, should the Gantt chart review activities over the duration of 5 years, even if the activities will be the same for each year?
Yeah, I mean, the Gantt chart is just a time and event. Here's what we're going to do. Here's who's going to do it. It's always good with each specific aim or each next step to have a short paragraph about the backup plan in case the brilliant ideas turn out to be not so brilliant. But and you can go online and find the Gantt charts, but it really is an accounting of what you propose to do. And that's really important, I think, for 3 groups. One is for the applicant, so it helps you organize your proposal. Number 2, it's very helpful for me in navigating an application, because once the applications come in, I can't read them all, but once they're post-review, I do, and it's really difficult to figure out what's going on without a good Gantt chart. And the third part of this is the reviewers. Remember, these are busy people, and so what you want is for the reviewer to look at your abstract, maybe your impact, look at the team, make sure everybody's there, look at the logic model, and then look at the Gantt chart. And if they say, wow, this is a cool idea, it's got a good team, the plan makes sense. So they're heading into the 25 pages or the 20, which kind of blank. Anyway, they're heading into the research plan feeling pretty positive about what you're doing. And that Gantt chart can only help. And sometimes people put them in and they look like a symmetrical wall coloring. I mean, symmetry doesn't help. What you want is detail. So people can look at it and see exactly what you propose to do for 5 years. And if you're going to be doing the same stuff every year for 5 years, that doesn't indicate much formative evaluation to kind of test each step and improve upon it.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to talk more, on this, you can contact Tony. Young, you want to take this one? I think you did that before, also answer this question. If the institution has an active SEPA project, can they apply in a different discipline, scientific discipline?
So that means the institution, if your institution already has an active SEPA project and your institution is still eligible to submit a SEPA application or SEPA applications for this year, if the topics are different.
If the same PI submits the second application, then I think they can only overlap 6 months only, before the next SEPA award can begin. Is a detailed in-kind budget necessary for the application?
No, the,
Christy, you want to?
yeah, go ahead, Christy.
In kind? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. A detailed budget
Is a detailed in-kind budget? It's a question.
No, a detailed in-kind is not required. Matching is not required in the NOFO. A detailed budget is required if you have institutional commitment. Please explain that in your application, but a detailed in-kind budget is not required.
Yeah.
And this has only come up periodically. Kirsty, please comment. It's been a while. We had an application that wanted to get the full SEPA money so they could then go out and peddle it to other vendors to get more money. And your proposed SEPA project has to be accomplished with the budget and the research plan submitted, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Christy, I think the next one, I think maybe your answer, I think will be already given, Can we include meal plans for breakfast and lunch for the undergrad and high school student participant during the summer?
If you can make it applicable to the project, yes, as long as it's required. And your institution has a policy in place that covers meals, yes, you can request those.
Is the external advisory board sufficient for outside evaluation? Tony?
It doesn't have to be external, it just has to be independent. And one of the issues to think about is that in many cases, we'll have SEPA key personnel who have expertise in evaluation, and it's quite proper for the SEPA, say, key personnel who have expertise in this to collect evaluation data, but the analysis of those data has to be done by somebody who's viewed as completely independent. So the external versus independent is really no longer an issue. It's just somebody who is independent. No conflict of interest concerns.
The next question, I think, Michelle, is addressed to you. I mean, asking you to elaborate on the not a research project. My reading of this educational project is to implement an innovative educational project, collect data such as student survey and disseminate.
Sure.
Is that considered
Let me explain the difference here
Yeah.
between educational research, which is in the realm of NSF, and the SEPA program. So it's important to structure your SEPA project understanding that distinction. SEPA projects are educational projects, and we expect rigorous analytic tools to be used to improve the project as it's going, and certainly to analyze any outcomes so that they can benefit the community. But educational, and here's I guess the key point I would make. SEPA projects should be informed by educational research, but they are not educational research directly. If that is a distinction that will help you, that's good. There can be a little bit of a blur in this line, but if you start doing human subjects research where it's non-exempt, you have definitely crossed that line. That's, I guess, how I would put this. So keep that in mind as you're developing your application. And you're free to communicate specifics to your program officers.
overlap between an IES grant allowed with SEPA? IES, informal education science?
Yeah, that's Department of Education.
Yeah.
As long as the scientific content isn't overlapping. In fact, I had an email today from Ed Metz about a very interesting project. And we just need to sit down to make sure that the award that's that's pending for NIH, say NIGMS, doesn't have any scientific overlap with what the IES folks are doing. But they're very different programs, and in many cases, we have PIs with the expertise to get money from NSF and NIH and NIES.
Thank you. The next question, we are almost getting there. Michelle, I think you already addressed this one. Is an educational program allowed that targets a particular group that has been underrepresented or marginalized in STEM, such as Latinos, women, or rural students? Or does the program have to be open to everyone, regardless of identity or background?
So certainly no one can be excluded from participation, right? But that doesn't mean that the groups that you work with can't be overpopulated, overrepresented in their diverse populations, if you put it that way. So you have to be inclusive. You can't restrict someone from participating based on their race or ethnicity, but certainly working with schools, for example, that have diverse populations is completely allowable.
Yeah, about 15 years ago, there was a project at San Francisco State University called
Tony, I'm sorry, but we have 4 minutes left and we have other questions. So let's just try to get as many answered.
Yeah.
And if you don't get your question answered in the next 4 minutes, please email it to Tony and Yang and they will get back to you.
Yeah. I tried to make a Gantt chart and it became way too busy. I wrote it out as text by year and it was more readable. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Can a current co-investigator apply for another SEPA with overlapping with the current SEPA project?
Yes, as long as the scientific content is different.
Yes, co-investigator can, of course, submit a separate application, if they want, if he or she decides to do that. Okay. Are collaborations with the Department of Education in the state encouraged or allowed? Collaboration with the Department of Education in the state.
Yeah, we don't collaborate directly with the Department of Education, but we have many cases where SEPA projects funded collaborate with other projects funded by NSF or ED. So that's a common occurrence.
But I think an applicant may, I think, want to collaborate, with Department of Education in their state, they can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
They
allowed.
could just, instead of writing a SEPA, they could write a Department of Ed application.
The question is about if it is allowed collaboration between the Department of Education. Yes, it's allowed. Okay. I think we almost reached the end of the questions now. I don't see any more questions.
Okay, well, thank you all for attending. And when this video is prepared in a week or two, it will be posted on the SEPA website. I did throw that link in the chat if you can find it. And if you think of other questions, please contact Tony and Yang directly. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
And thanks to my co-presenters.